This calendar is on July. It's at July 2022. It says this girl's name is Julie. So here we have Julie and the month of July. Julie's name has two syllables. The J-U says Joe, could be Joe. The L-I, we know that word as lie. Yet we said Julie is Julie. And July is July. Why did we do that? Our oral vocabulary is responsible for all of that. Yes, our oral vocabulary. Our pronunciation of words depends on our oral vocabulary. Our oral vocabulary consists of those words that we understand when we hear them. So we know them and understand them just by hearing. Now our oral vocabulary then develops our oral vocabulary as we speak the words that we hear. So once we hear the words, we should now be able to produce them in speech. What happens if we say a word but we have never heard it? What happens if we don't know the speech sounds? Welcome to another Literacy Friday session. Today we continue our series on questioning and its role in comprehension, and we're going to look at how hearing problems may affect comprehension. Let's continue. So we said that our oral vocabulary consists of those words that we know and understand whenever we hear them, or AURAL vocabulary, oral. And then our oral vocabulary helps to develop our oral vocabulary, which are those words that we actually use when we're speaking, like we know what we're saying and we use them up. Now there's another set of vocabulary that we have to look at which affects our comprehension, and that's our orthographic vocabulary. Our orthographic vocabulary consists of those words that even if we don't know what they sound like, we actually recognize them on sight, we understand them, and we know what they mean. So let's recap before we continue. Oral vocabulary are the words that we understand when we hear them. Oral vocabulary are those words that we speak and we know what we're saying when we speak them. And our orthographic vocabulary are those words that even if we don't know the pronunciation of them, we still understand what they mean. Welcome to another Literacy Friday session. In last week's session, we would have looked at how the brain processes the words that it hears and what could have affected our comprehension and our discrimination of such data that it receives. And in today's session, we're going to look at what happens to persons who have hearing problems. How might this affect their comprehension? And we're going to look at what we call silent speech as well. While we're reading, yes, there is something happening where we're able to sound out the words, and we're also looking at what happens if we don't read aloud. Some persons love to read aloud, others love to engage in silent reading. Which is better? Neither. All I know, there's a time and place for everything. Now, while we're engaging in silent reading, we're not mindful of the fact that there's sounds flowing through our mind. So though we're not voicing the words, we're subvocalizing. To subvocalize is to internally pronounce words while reading. So vocalization is a process, and it's also the result of that mental pronunciation of words while reading. It is also referred to as silent speech. Subvocalization relies on our oral vocabulary, so we have to know the sounds before we're able to even mentally pronounce the sounds. Now, if we don't know these words, then we at least need to know the phonic elements. Those are the speech sounds and the associated letters. So even if the word is not in any of our vocabulary, whether it's our orthographic vocabulary, oral vocabulary, or oral vocabulary, once we have an understanding of the phonic elements, then we are able to break down that word, sound it out mentally, or even read aloud. But if we're engaging in silent reading, then we can sub-vocalize if we understand the phonic elements. For example, let's take a look at this word I made up. Now, it doesn't exist. Well, not to my knowledge, because I just made it up. But if you're looking at the word, it would be foreign to you. You don't have to sound it out aloud if you're aware of the speech sounds. So if you're aware of the speech sounds, you can sub-vocalize and perhaps say, In your mind, you're doing this, of course. Internally, you process. So you mentally sound it out and say B says B, A says A or A, T says T, E says E or E. And if you're good at phonics, within a split of a second, you might just say, this word is potential or potential, and you make a conclusion and move on. You won't process it so much because, of course, it's not in your oral vocabulary or your oral vocabulary. And naturally, if it's not in your orthographic vocabulary, then you would have had need to try and sound it out mentally or otherwise. So as you sub-vocalize, even though you have never come across this word before, your auditory cortex is now going to store that data to say, I now conclude that this word is potential. Now, if you go somewhere after that and you hear someone says, hand me that potential, then the auditory cortex is now going to assimilate that sound, store it away and say, here, I saw the word before, I thought it was potential. Now I'm hearing potential. And it makes a neural connection. And that is then stored in the brain for future reference. Can a deaf person sub-vocalize? Think about that for a moment. Can a deaf person sub-vocalize? The obvious answer is no. But if you said yes, you are also correct. Now, I know they say that we can answer a question both yes and no, but I'm going to explain. If a person was born deaf, he or she would not be able to sub-vocalize simply because the brain would have not stored the speech sounds. If you have not heard the speech sounds, you will not be able to store them. So the words are not in the memory bank, so naturally they would not be able to store it. It's not a part of their oral vocabulary, so they would not be able to sub-vocalize. Now, if a person was not born deaf and that person has recollection of the speech sounds or recollection of some words in their oral vocabulary, then that person, although now deaf, or if the person has a hearing impairment, or if the person is assisted by a hearing aid, that person may be able to sub-vocalize. And I say may because they may not have knowledge of all the speech sounds or a recollection of them, but they may have a recollection of the words in their oral vocabulary. So what happens if we cannot sub-vocalize? If we cannot sub-vocalize or we do not sub-vocalize, that's fine. There's a solution. Persons with hearing impairments and deafness, they do not need to sub-vocalize because they rely heavily on their orthographic vocabulary. So if you're not able to sub-vocalize, then you will rely heavily on those words that you know by sight. That is why it's important to develop our sight vocabulary, and we would have looked at this in previous lessons about sight vocabulary. It's one of the earliest things that we develop as literate learners. We try to learn words on sight. There are some words that we will never be able to sound out. So once you're not able to sub-vocalize, it's good to develop an understanding of words and what the words are associated with. So for persons in the deaf community, they spend a lot of time making word associations. So if a word is connected to a particular image, they store that quite easily. And there are numerous studies that are being done now, and some are proving that persons who are deaf or persons with hearing impairments, they are not at a disadvantage when it comes to reading comprehension. In fact, some researchers are saying that they have proof that persons with hearing impairments and deafness actually are more efficient readers than those who are able to hear. And of course, that's all under investigation because several factors have to be considered in such. I would have also received questions about what happens with auditory comprehension with the deaf. With the deaf community, persons in the deaf community, they also rely heavily on looking at your lips when you're speaking. So even if they're not hearing you, they're able. And once more, if it is a case where the person was not born deaf, then they may be able to actually sound out what you say or connect more readily with what your lips are saying, even though they're not hearing. So, do we need to subvocalize? It would be good if we subvocalize and practice doing so. For there are times when, especially in exam conditions, we are not able to speak aloud or read aloud, as I should say. Can we truly practice subvocalization? That's debatable, because it's a natural occurrence once we have those speech sounds or the words in our oral vocabulary. What we can practice is silent reading, and through silent reading, we will develop our skills at subvocalization. And the more we listen to people, I keep stressing this in lessons, the more we listen to people, the more we speak to people, especially people of different backgrounds than ours, is the more we will develop our vocabulary. And that's all of our vocabulary that I'm talking about. That's it for today's session. Join us next week when we will continue looking at questioning and its role in comprehension, and we're going to look at auditory comprehension and do some auditory comprehension activities.